Welcome to Woodbury Writes Podcast. I'm your host, Sandy Carlson, and I'm here today with Paul Hensler of Naugatuck, Connecticut. Paul is a prolific writer, a lifelong Connecticut resident, and an avid baseball fan. He's written about his local team, the Greyhounds, in the book Pride of the Greyhounds, Ray Legenza and 64 Straight Wins by Connecticut's best high school baseball team, right up to books about the Yankees. Welcome to the podcast, Paul.
Thank you so much. And just a point of technicality, I actually live in Beacon Falls rather than Naugatuck. I grew up in Naugatuck, but moving back to Beacon Falls has been kind of a homecoming for me.
So Paul, tell us more about you. You're a Beacon Falls resident. You grew up in Naugatuck. You've written about the Greyhounds. Tell us about your inspiration and what keeps you writing on this topic.
I want to be informative and creative regarding the subjects that I write. And obviously, many years ago, being a cover-to-cover reader of the Sporting News when it was really a heavily baseball-oriented publication, it was really a coming of age. Growing up in Naugatuck and catching the wave of enthusiasm that just really washed over the town because of the success of the high school baseball team, really beginning in 1969 for my purposes. And I stepped back to 1969 in the book because that was such a tremendous year. So when you're in your earliest teen years and you're exposed to this, and then the 1969 New York Mets magically win the World Series, all of a sudden there's more fuel being added to this fire. And I had a grandfather that was really that generational connection. The Hall of Fame uses that as one of their touchstone marketing phrases, if you will, connecting generations. And that was what did it for me, because my father was never really that much into sports, but I made a connection with my grandfather with regard to old-time baseball and baseball history. So as you're steeped in this environment, you just kind of grow up naturally following the game, learning more about it. When you go to a high school game, you know some of the players are out on the field. And then by the time you become a senior in high school, you really know almost everybody on the team rather than being an intimidated freshman who's afraid to ask any of the real high level seniors as far as their particular experience. There's just too much of a gap there between freshman and senior. But again, when you're in this environment growing up, it just builds and builds and builds with the interest. And I never thought that I would be writing about it all these many years later, but that became a product of earning my master's degree in history. That I've always been a nonfiction reader. I enjoy contemporary American history, 20th century American history. So this was just almost a natural segue that as I wrote more and more about baseball, and then realizing that, 2022 is the 50th anniversary of the end of this famous winning streak. And I thought myself a good candidate to be able to tackle the chore of chronicling everything that took place with that team. And that really came at the suggestion of one of my classmates who I knew beginning in junior high school. There was a little bit of chatter on Facebook around 2018, 2019, and some comments went back and forth and offering the opinion that, somebody should really write a book about the great teams that we had. And then Brenda Rollis is her name, Brenda Rollis Ryder, lives in Florida now. She knew that I had written some of these other baseball books, and she stuck the comment out there that I flatter myself with. And she said, well, if anybody's going to write a book about the winning streak, Paul would be the guy to do it. So I picked up that gauntlet and ran with it. And the result is the latest book.
That's great to be encouraged by your former classmates. So it sounds like the local community has found its new location in the ether through Facebook.
Yes.
So what was the research process like for you to get all the information together for this book?
That was pretty amazing in itself. I was finishing up my book, Gathering Crowds, during the pandemic. I had gotten the rest of the material that I knew that I would need to finish that book in March of 2020. So all of a sudden, everybody's going into lockdown. I received a bunch of information from the Hall of Fame research library, which I've worked with for many times over the years for the books that I've written. And I finished the manuscript for that book, and I started to work on another project about the New Haven Railroad. And I'd been kind of working on that on and off for quite some time, but there wasn't any serious investment of time or resources in that. But then all of a sudden, this comment about talking about the winning streak came up again. And then I realized, okay, let me see if I can pivot and start writing this book about Naugatuck. And along about early September of 2020, yes, 2020, we're still in the pandemic, of course. There's no vaccine or anything. We're still pretty much locked down. But I started to put some notes together on how to go about doing this. And I made contact with Jim Hankey, who was one of the star players of that team. And he had some scrapbook material, but not a whole lot. But at least it got me going with the process. And he had a very key role with the 1969 team and for 2 years during the winning streak years. What ended up happening was I connected with two guys who were the co-captains of the 1972 team. And by incredible good fortune, not only were they willing to help me, but their fathers back in the day had curated multiple scrapbooks with almost every newspaper clipping of every game that they played in. So it eliminated the angst of having to go to newspapers.com and finding most of the editions of the Naugatuck Daily News, but then finding all the Saturday editions only had the even number pages and they didn't have the odd number. Some things like that, you just wonder how things like that even happen. So that provided probably 95% of what I needed, but then I still had gaps to fill that just mysteriously cropped up. And I went to the website for the Connecticut State Library because that's where I was intending to do most of my research, because I knew they had all the microfilms of the Naugatuck Daily News. It wouldn't have been an issue if I had access to the library, but the pandemic changed that. So I went to the library's website, and it had ask a question of the librarian or something like that. They had a feature you could submit a question. So I was stuck trying to find a particular article from whatever day it was. So I provided the specifics in the question. I said, I'm looking for Naugatuck Daily News, whatever the date happened to be. Naugatuck beat, I'm just making this up for an example. Naugatuck beat Ansonia 4-3, and the game was played on May 15th, 1969, something like that. And when I hit the submit button, I'm thinking this is a state-run operation. If I hear anything within 3 weeks, I'll be lucky. And that afternoon, I got a reply with the image of the newspaper.
Nice.
And I was absolutely flabbergasted. And the same thing happened the next day. And I get almost instantaneous turnaround and her name was Susan Bigelow. She's the reference librarian. And she said, oh, this is really interesting. What are you working on? So we connected through email that way, and that was a godsend because she was able to fill in all the gaps that I couldn't find either on newspapers.com or the scrapbooks. Absolute godsend. So I have no gaps in anything, with the exception of at times relatively poor coverage by the local newspaper, because by the time they were playing regular season American Legion games, they barely got 2 paragraphs mentioned. So you had scanned information to talk about American Legion baseball, but the high school games were pretty well covered. And the tournament games of American Legion were very well covered, but the regular season was not quite hit or miss, but very, very scanty compared to the regular high school season. Also instrumental to this was having the ability to be able to connect with former players, either in person, through email, through text messages, whatever, and sometimes by phone. I recorded phone calls so that I could make a transcript of what the interview was. Early on in the process, what I realized was that I'm asking this person a question about a baseball game from over 50 years ago. I can't sit down with somebody right then and there, whether it's in person or by phone. Here's the question, and expect to sit there for 5 seconds and get any kind of a coherent answer. So as long as I got that person's email address, I said, fine, here's what I'll do. I'll make up a bunch of questions for you. I'll send them to you so you can think about them for a couple of days and brush away the cobwebs, and then we'll talk about it. And more often than not, a couple of days after I sent the email, I would get these incredibly thoughtful, detailed replies back. So not only did I not have to transcribe anything, I could just, with some light editing, I could just cut and paste their comments right into the narrative of what I was writing. So nothing got lost in the translation. There was no misquoting or anything. It was an absolute joy to be able to do something like that through modern communication, through email especially. So all this material between the newspapers and the interviews, which I say interviews with the air quotes only because it could have been through email. A couple were by personal conversations too, but all this rolled in is what fortified the narrative that I was writing. It is real good, true first-person accounts, real good primary source material.
That's incredible that you've got now this firsthand primary source archive as well as your story, or as told by you, right? That's really fascinating. Were a lot of the former players, were they still local?
Yes and no. Even I remember going to a 10th year reunion, which is kind of stilted way back in 1984. But even at that point in time, realizing they made up a little directory of the students from your class. And even 10 years after graduation, we had people that were scattered coast to coast and border to border. So, and that's pretty much the same with the classes of these former players. Some never left town, some are within the state, some live wherever. So some are down in Florida, South Carolina, wherever. They're just scattered all over the place. But again, I just had the good fortune of being able to connect with enough of them that I was able to get their words and incorporate their words into the narrative. But I prefer the in-person just because you have that je ne sais quoi of being able to facial expressions or tone of voice, that sort of thing. And I had my extended conversation I had with Mickey Fortin, who I think leads off chapter 5 in the book. And he was pretty emotional about some of this because as glorious as those days were with the winning streak and the team doing so great, he had difficulties with it, as I describe in the book. And I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to talk to him at length about his experience, and he backfilled some of his personal history that makes his story so compelling. And I was glad to have the opportunity to be able to do that.
That's terrific. I'm wondering if you could help this non-sports person that you're talking to. Give me an insight into what it is about the sport of baseball particularly that is so, I'm not even sure what the word is, that brings people together, that lives in memory and the details come back. What is it about baseball that makes it a cohesive experience for the people who either play or watch the game? What is that?
I think that goes back to the old saying about baseball, hot dogs, baseball, apple pie, and Chevrolet. That whatever that marketing gimmick was, that it's something we grow up with. And back through the 40s and 50s and 60s, Little League really had its own place. In a more modern day, now we've lost that because soccer is an easier sport. It's less complicated. There's more exercise for the kids. Mm-hmm. Everybody's running around at the same time, as opposed to baseball that seems to have fallen into its own sclerosis, if you will, that we're standing around waiting for the pitcher to throw the ball to the batter and see what the batter does. We had more patience years ago. And I think at that time, being able to grow up with that there were always the folk heroes that we looked up to. So the kids growing up in the 40s, they loved Joe DiMaggio or Ted Williams, and then Mickey Mantle at a later age. We always had these baseball heroes with us, and it was easier to organize a baseball game than it was a football game. Basketball only became professional, I believe, in 1940. It was right around the end of World War II. I remember when I was a freshman in high school, getting Sports Illustrated had a 25th anniversary commemorative issue about the National Basketball Association. Of course, basketball itself was around longer than that, but as a professional sport, things were a little bit different. So we would grow up with baseball, with Little League and Babe Ruth League. Again, all the heroes from our youth, and then we follow that in our adulthood. And in this part of the country, especially with the Yankees being so dominant for so long, it was just a natural attraction to want to go to Yankee Stadium to see the Yankees play. So it's really something that you grow up with. And that certainly affected me as a beginning of our conversation, that as a teenager, I was steeped in this. And then with the high school team doing so well, that was just another added factor. And in this part of the country, even marking it down a little bit more definitively, the Naugatuck Valley, generally speaking, has always been very strong with sports. The lower part of the valley with Derby Shelton with football. Shelton had a very successful baseball program that dovetailed very nicely with Naugatucks in the 1970s, mid 1970s. If you step back, even to family picnics, somebody brought a softball and a bat, and you'd get two families together, and you would have enough people to play a softball game even. So your modified version of baseball. Played wiffle ball when I was in high school. There's another thing. You only needed a couple kids to be able to play wiffle ball. So there's some connection, however direct or indirect, that found its way to get back to baseball. I don't think families went on picnics and played basketball games because you had to have a basketball court, but you went to picnic grounds and you have big open field. Well, you had a catch, the fathers and sons would have catches, that sort of thing, or play hit the bat. So it's something that you grow up with that I think really gets in your blood. And that's how it was for me and a lot of my friends of that generation.
Okay, Paul, I think you're maybe dusting off a couple memories for me of those backyard picnics with the wiffle ball set, which I believe is a product manufactured
in Shelton, Connecticut.
Yeah, there you go. And you could have even a clumsy kid like me could have a certain amount of proficiency. I'd get to something. I'd get somewhere. I'd run that circle,
Yep.
It's funny now that you say the legends. I remember I teach English to kids, and where I teach, we have a lot of Red Sox fans. But that aside, in the freshman curriculum, we have the Old Man and the Sea, and of course, Joe DiMaggio was a sort of the soulmate in Santiago's mind. He just adores Joe DiMaggio, the immigrant who made something with his life. My students don't know who that is.
Oh.
And that's interesting because when I was growing up, Joe DiMaggio was retired, and my uncle and my cousins were in a hardware store somewhere in Stamford, Connecticut, and Joe DiMaggio was there, and they got their picture taken with Joe, and that stood on my grandmother's piano forever. So that was that was the family connection, but for me, it was very, very, very peripheral. But as I listen to you speak, I think I can find a connection there. I'm fascinated by it, and I think it's heartwarming, because it is a backyard outdoor. Make the best with what you got, have a game, and away you go.
It gets to your point, though, too, that here it is decades after the fact of this chance meeting with Joe DiMaggio, and that memory just still comes flooding right back.
Yeah. And for me, it's the picture in my head is my grandmother's piano, yep, with the picture on it. And he had his arm around my cousin Michael and my cousin Kimmy, and they were so proud and happy to have that thing, Yep. So, but back to your work. Did any of the Greyhounds go on to play professional ball?
Several got drafted. The amateur draft began in 1965, so it really was kind of in its infancy at that particular time, and it allowed a player like Ernie Bessette, who was drafted by the Montreal Expos, Rich Montoni, who was class of '73. He was part of the street team also. He was drafted in 1976 after he had played for the University of Miami. He was batting cleanup for Miami, so that certainly drew attention because Miami is a huge baseball school. He played in their minor league system for a little bit, as did Ernie Bessette, who suffered a serious misfortune. He was home from a school break, I believe, in between semester breaks, which may have been, I think, in 1971 or 72, got hit in the eye with a snowball. And that not quite ended his career, but it put a very serious dent into it. And he played Class A minor league ball in the Mets organization for 1 year, and that was it for his career. But we did have a workhorse who graduated from high school in 1970, John Canera. He was drafted by the Pittsburgh Pirates, but did not sign. He went to Eastern Connecticut State College, back then ECSU today, and set all kinds of records there, drew the attention of many scouts by the time that he was ready to graduate in 1974. He ultimately signed with the California Angels and made his way through their farm system, every rung of the ladder. He also pitched summer ball up at Cape Cod and excelled up there. He did make it to the majors finally for a slightly extended cup of coffee at the end of 1977, and then for a couple games also in 1978. Unfortunately, his shoulder finally gave out, and it was too many pitches over so many years. He used up his quota of pitches, I guess is probably the kind way to say it. But he developed arm trouble in 1978, and he went into retirement. But that was really a touchstone moment for so many people who saw him pitch in high school, who saw him come back. He pitched for the Pan Am Games too in consecutive years, and he was really just the shining example of the kid made good, and you felt so proud because you saw him play. And again, looking the Sporting News and kind of following his trail through the Angels farm system, we finally got that call in September of 1977. It was really an aha moment. And I talked to him last year. We had a banquet, there's a sort of reunion, a commemorative banquet for the baseball team. And he said that when he was called up, he lockered with Nolan Ryan and Frank Tanana, who were the two big guns of the Angels staff at that point. And he said, yeah, Frank Tanana kind of took me under his wing to shepherd him through the major league process. So he still has fond memories of that. But baseball being a business, if you're injured and you can't pitch, then management gets angry because they've cultivated you to finally reach the big stage, and then all of a sudden, poof, there it goes. And well, we need somebody to pitch tonight. We don't have time to worry about tending to injuries and such. So it can be a cruel business too. But that was the big shining star for us, that the streak teams, we did have one guy that made it to the major leagues.
So clearly place matters to you as a writer and as a part of a community of baseball enthusiasts. So Pride of the Greyhounds definitely has a local audience.
Yes.
A Naugatuck audience, a Connecticut audience. How do you suppose the book speaks to an even broader audience? What would this say to somebody on the other side of the country?
That's a difficult question, but I'll be honest in answering that it probably doesn't hold a whole lot of weight. When I first started the symposium gigs, attending cultural symposiums up at Cooperstown, one of the first ones that I attended, there was a group from Oakland, California that came in. And the reason was that there was a high school out there, McClymonds High School, and the coach back in the mid-1950s had the good fortune of having 3 future major leaguers on his team in 1 year. Frank Robinson, a Hall of Famer, Curt Flood, who arguably might be a Hall of Famer, and Vada Pinson, who was also not quite a Hall of Fame caliber, but excellent. He had these 3 guys all together for 1 year. And I think if Naugatuck had a similar alignment, that if we had a couple guys that got sent to the major leagues, then it probably would have been a bigger story. But unfortunately, we just didn't have that caliber. We weren't gifted in that respect. As I started this project, though, 2 of my baseball writer colleagues said, "Oh, you have to read a book called One Shot at Forever." And I referenced this in the Naugatuck book, and it's about a little town in Macon, Illinois, population of something like 1,800 people, and they barely had enough kids to scrape together to have a baseball team. And this is going on at the same time that Naugatuck has its winning streak. And the coach of Macon was absolutely polar opposite of the Naugatuck coach, but they became it was a Cinderella team. This little team made their way through the state tournament, and they beat Lane Tech from Chicago. And I had to look this up because I couldn't believe it myself, that the enrollment at Lane Tech was something like, I don't know, like 4,000 boys or something. So you can imagine the student population that they could draw from to create a really powerful baseball team. And Macon beat them in the semifinals this one particular year. And that was like their World Series. And unfortunately, after they had the exhilaration of beating this powerful team, which nobody expected that they could, they had to play the championship game immediately after that. And of course, they were spent at that point. There was nothing they could do to win. And so they end up losing the final. But it was just an incredible run for them. And a reporter for Sports Illustrated went back and wrote their whole story, just kind of the same way that I chronicled the Naugatuck story. But it had more of an impact because the folks at Sports Illustrated saw the value in sending somebody out to devote amount of time for putting this book together. And it really is a rags to riches story from such a small school to beat somebody from a big school from a big city like Chicago, that it had more cachet to it. I think if we'd been in similar circumstances, then maybe I would have been as fortunate. But I'm still happy with the result, because this is the most gratifying project that I've done so far, because of the connections that I made with people that were so instrumental to the story of the success of Naugatuck, that I'm happy with the result. So if people in Washington State or New Mexico aren't reading it, well, that's okay.
Oh, you know what? I guess part of what I'm thinking is the richness of the story must resonate. I mean, it resonates with me, and I'm not a baseball person, and just the sense of place and of a community supporting its team and getting somewhere and being successful as a group, and the larger story of how you put this together and how you were able to pull all these scrapbooks together and then have a connection with the librarian and draw on those connections elsewhere. I think that's the whole story of this book, really, and I'm just thinking about the importance of local journalism and documenting what young people do in all facets, whether it's sports or, schoolwork or whatever other achievements, that for all the technology we have and all the scanning we can do and all the ancestry.com stuff and what have you, and online libraries and newspaper.com, what it really comes down to is finding those treasure troves and the good fortune that those things still existed.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, in the modern age, even though we have all these tools at our disposal to be able to find these things out about what happened in the past, but if we move forward to the modern day, again, baseball, to me, I don't think it has the cachet that it used to. And kids are pulled in umpteen different directions today. And I think back to when I was in high school, I thought, gee, it would have been neat if we had a volleyball team, because I did like to play volleyball. And now you've got volleyball, you have, I think, cross country in the fall, but then I think you have indoor track in the wintertime. You have track is more popular too than it was back when I was in high school. We had a soccer team that was not very good in more recent years. Now Naugatuck has had one of the best soccer teams in the state. So you have all these different things that are pulling kids in all these different directions. Besides, yeah, there's homework to do. There should be other extracurricular activities besides this, but back 50 years ago, it seemed like there was just a much more limited scope of what was available for those types of activities. And you didn't want to spend time with your friends, or you went to the movies, that sort of thing. And now everybody's on a computer, they're playing games on their phone or what have you. So there's far more distraction in the modern day than there was 50 years ago. And that certainly plays into people's ability to devote time and energy to all these different distractions.
And as you say, a game that requires patience, that has its own pace.
Yes.
That's an added factor. And it's interesting, at work, some of our kids they play 4 sports.
Yeah.
They're, after the soccer season's over, it's winter soccer, or it's some other league of soccer, and it's nonstop movement. And, so it's almost foreign to this idea of a game that lets you stand still for a few minutes, Yeah.
And one reason that Naugatuck derives so much success is the fact that we had a lot of multi-sport kids. Not everybody, but many of them would play 2 or 3 sports. And one question I had for one of the former players, and of course the answer was hiding in plain sight for me, and I should have known, but when you have turnover from one year to the next, you have a good crop of seniors that have used up their high school eligibility. Obviously, they graduate. And now last year's juniors are going to be the new leaders, they're the new seniors. And what about bringing those other kids along, the freshmen that were now going to become sophomores, that sort of thing? How you have this constant conveyor belt of players. And how do you adjust? How do you adapt to new situations? And I forget who, but one of them mentioned to me, and he said, well, don't forget, he said, we played multiple sports. It's not like you have this whole fresh batch of strange people showing up to play basketball or showing up to play baseball in the spring. we knew each other because we went to school together. We played other sports, or they would play outside of school, involved with different activities. So they weren't strangers to themselves. And I'm glad that he emphasized that point, because that helped me understand better how this success kind of perpetuated itself, more so than all of a sudden, gee, we had a terrible year last year, and all of a sudden we're gangbusters. That wasn't really the case.
Right.
There was that winning tradition that gets passed along from one year to the next.
So the skills really transfer across the sports, whether it's their social skills or their athletic skills or just their general athleticism. And so having a community where the kids are aware of each other growing up is also helpful. So Paul, you've written about a lot of different aspects of baseball over time. Can you tell me, as a reader, who are the authors, or who's the author that has influenced you, or that you consider sort of a companion as a writer? Who's your go-to?
Great question. And I've always enjoyed David McCullough, even though I've not really read all that much of him. Ron Chernow, who's written several extensive biographies. The only book of his that I've really read was about maybe 5-6 years ago. He wrote the biography of Ulysses S. Grant. So it was really just magisterial. And you see the way that he writes and puts his material together is really quite noteworthy. And as far as by the number of pages of one particular author, I would also credit Rick Atkinson, who's a military historian. He wrote what he refers to as the Liberation Trilogy of the United States involvement in World War II in the European theater. He doesn't get into the Pacific theater, but he wrote the entire story in 3 volumes of America's involvement in Europe during World War II. And I just love the way he would build into his descriptions, because he actually would visit these different places.
Right.
And he's really getting a good ground level view to describe things to the reader about going to Tunisia, and he's describing the lay of the land, what some of the flowers were. So if you were a soldier actually fighting there, you're going to be seeing some of these same things. And to put the reader in his shoes as if you're actually there, I found to be extremely important. It is a tool for transporting the reader to that particular place. But at the end of the day, I think probably my favorite author is Robert Caro, with the history of New York and such. That it really helped to expand my interest in the history of New York City, the modern history especially. And I don't know if Caro himself has this as a motto, but because he writes so extensively and so detailed, the description that I've made up for him, whether he's actually said it himself, is don't use 50 words to describe something when you can use 500 words to describe something.
That's great.
And he gave an interview as part of his Turn Every Page documentary. I think that's where I saw it, where somebody asked about The Power Broker, his breakthrough biography of Robert Moses. And he admitted that he had to cut like 350,000 words out of that. And it's still a 1,300 page book. So you can imagine, yeah, I know it boggles the mind. That's enough for 2 more books right there. And when he took on the project of writing the life of Lyndon Baines Johnson, which is everybody's holding their breath, hoping that he finally completes this last volume, which is now 11 years in the works now, if I'm counting right. It's 11 years now since the last one came out. The detail that he goes into and how he approaches the craft of writing, if people have, especially in this part of Connecticut, if you have the opportunity to go to New York, go to Manhattan, go to the New York Historical Society, and up on the 2nd floor, I think the 2nd or 3rd floor, they have the Turn Every Page exhibit. And it has kind of a run through of his life story, but it has artifacts related to how he goes about the craft of writing. And it has these initial drafts that he would just write out longhand on legal pads, and then typing up the first drafts and then ripping through those with all kinds of comments and stuff. So you see the process of how this morphs from one phase to the next, of how seriously he takes it, and why it takes so long for him to write these books. But every one of his books has been a phenomenal bestseller. So he obviously has the formula right, but just at the age of 87, we hope, a lot of people are hoping that he can get through this last volume of LBJ's life. But I look at that as an inspiration, because he wants to get into the nuts and bolts to explain everything to the reader of why these things happen, why people act the way that they do. And from his perspective, in many interviews that he's done, he's always been fascinated with how do these people acquire all this power? And that seems to be the touchstone, the main running theme of all of the books that he writes and the people that he covers. Where do they get this power? And he goes into massive detail of how this happens.
Well, in hearing you talk about the authors that you value, I see you as being one among them in terms of the loving care you bring to the details that you incorporate, and your respect for the integrity of the story, getting it right, getting the voices in there, and making the community of Naugatuck available to whoever your reader is. And I think that is the artistry of this kind of writing, is to take somebody who just flew in from outer space and has never seen baseball, and to be there and to feel the pride and to feel the sense of community that comes out of that. It's tremendous.
Thank you. And when I start a project, usually the publisher or editor I'm working with, they'll ask for an annotated table of contents. And that really serves as my roadmap, because then I've got ideas of what I want to incorporate in each chapter. And rather than writing a formal outline, I just kind of go with whatever I've incorporated with those annotations and just let it run with that. And I don't look at a particular word count overall, but I kind of know, just looking at the bottom margin of the Word document as I've been going along with it for a while, and say, okay, I'm up to 4,000 words, and I know in my head I've gotten X so far in that particular part of the chapter. So I kind of use that as a roadmap also for keeping track of things, because ultimately they're only looking for maybe 100,000 words or whatever for the whole size of the book. So I do have to keep that in mind. But as I'm going through the writing process, I'm just going with the material that I've got. And if I have that stuff available to me, it's going to find a way into the narrative. And to be able to craft it, whatever I'm talking about, in a particular instance, whether it's a person or an event, sometimes I even have to do on-the-fly research and that was very helpful in the Naugatuck book, because I found out some things about American Legion baseball that I would not have known if I hadn't gone those few extra steps. You have to put that in the book too. So when I finally came down the stretch, and I've got all end notes, and I've got the index that I had to create for the book, because I wanted to do an index for it also, all said and done, I sat back and I says, I never would have imagined I got a 300-page book out of a high school baseball team.
So Paul, would you share with our listeners what you think is the best line you ever wrote, and why you chose it, to give them a sense of your voice and your style?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
I do book reviews for a publication called Nine, which is a journal of baseball history and culture. And back about 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to review a new biography of Bill Veeck. And he was a baseball team owner, and he was known for his zany promotions, but he wanted people to come to the ballpark and have a good time. And he did have a championship ball club in Cleveland. He owned the Cleveland Indians in 1948. They won the World Series that year. But he just always had this wonderful spirit that he wanted people to come to the ballpark and have a good time. So he was very fan friendly, he was very approachable. And he was also victimized in World War II. He served on Guadalcanal with an artillery unit, and he had suffered a leg injury from the artillery. Long story short, he ended up having part of his leg amputated. Mm-hmm. And then he was a horrific smoker. So he had all the ill health effects in later life from that. So by the end of his life, he's really in very, very failing health. And Hank Greenberg was his longtime associate running the baseball team for the Cleveland Indians. And Veeck is now on his deathbed. And Hank Greenberg comes to visit him. And it's really a very touching scene, because Veeck says to Greenberg, he says, why don't we buy the Cleveland Indians again? So here he's on his deathbed, and he still has such love for the game. So what I ended up writing in my review, and it's very, very short, but I said, by the time of his death, Bill Veeck had lost a leg, a lung, and most of his eyesight and ability to hear, but he never lost his heart. And it had to make the distinction of a physical heart versus an emotional heart. And I just kept it succinct like that, and it just spoke volumes about here this man had suffered all these physical ailments and such over his life, but he still had this love for the game. And I thought that just that simple synopsis of all these things that happened, but he never lost his heart, that he loved the game so much. And even his plaque up at the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown says he was a champion of the little guy, that he was just such an approachable guy who had a love for the game that was really really contagious.
Right, and what you're saying makes me think that baseball really is sort of a microcosm of the American dream idea.
Yes,
and that everybody celebrated this sort of beautiful thing, really.
And part of the reason I wrote that the way that I did, the famous World War II correspondent Ernie Pyle, who I never read all that much of, but just remember he had this incredible way of taking any scene, describing it beautifully in such simple terms. So almost like an anti-Robert Caro, if you will, just had a great way. It just had this great way of describing things that even though you weren't out in the battlefield or whatever, just describing things that were going on, he had a beautiful way of doing it in such a simple style.
Yeah, and doesn't that tell us all, no matter who we are, that the reporter trusts our ability to connect and understand?
Yeah, to be able to paint that picture without actually to use words only rather than photographs. That's quite a talent. It really is.
It is. Well, thank you, Paul, for your time having this conversation about Pride of the Greyhounds and the craft of writing and your love of the game of baseball. I've really appreciated our time together. And I would like our listeners to know that if they search up Paul Hensler on Google with Hensler, they'll find your books. They can also go to paulhensler.com.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, Sandy. Thank you.
Thank you.